Welcome back to Midnight Mysteries, everyone. Today, we're looking at Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in US history who is often overlooked when it comes to true crime because of the more publicized cases in the genre. Samuel Little's victims were not just numbers on a police report. Samuel Little's entry into the world was marked by instability and neglect. Born in Reynolds, Georgia in 1940, his early life was far from idyllic. His mother, reportedly a prostitute, cast a long shadow over Little's life. Little's early years were spent drifting between homes. He struggled academically and exhibited a disturbing lack of empathy. The seeds of Samuel Little's future darkness were sown in his troubled childhood. His early experiences shaped his perception of the world, twisting it into a dark and dangerous place. As Samuel Little transitioned into adolescence, the troubling patterns of his childhood intensified. His brushes with the law became more frequent, ranging from petty theft to more serious offences. Little's teenage years were marked by a growing fascination with violence. He began to exhibit predatory behaviour, targeting vulnerable individuals. The absence of a stable family structure left Little vulnerable to negative influences. The streets became his classroom, and hardened criminals became his mentors. The trajectory of his life was becoming tragically clear, a descent into the abyss of human depravity. Little's early adulthood was a continuation of his downward spiral. He drifted from town to town, living a nomadic existence fueled by petty crime. Little's criminal activities escalated, progressing to more violent offences. He honed his skills as a manipulator, preying on vulnerable individuals. The escalating violence in Little's crimes foreshadowed the horrific acts that would define his later years. Samuel Little's path to darkness was paved with missed opportunities for intervention. The monster within him was about to be unleashed upon the world. Little's criminal career began with a series of petty crimes. He was a thief, a con artist, always looking for an angle. His early offences provided him with a crucial education in deception. Shoplifting, burglary, and fraud became Little's stock in trade. His smooth talking and charming demeanour allowed him to disarm potential victims. Little's early encounters with the law were frequent but brief. These early brushes with the law were missed opportunities for those he perceived as weak. The escalating violence in Little's crimes painted a chilling picture of a man spiralling out of control. The late 1970s and early 1980s marked a turning point in Little's criminal trajectory. One of Little's earliest known victims was Patricia Ann Mount, found strangled in 1982. Another early victim was Melinda Thomas, also found murdered in 1982. Samuel Little's ability to evade capture in these early murders emboldened him. He learned to exploit the weaknesses of the justice system. As Samuel Little continued his killing spree, he refined his methods. He adopted a nomadic lifestyle, drifting from state to state. Little developed a specific modus operandi, targeting marginalized women. He would lure them with promises of money, drugs, or companionship. After committing his murders, Little would often dispose of the bodies in remote locations. Samuel Little's nomadic lifestyle and refined methods allowed him to operate with impunity for decades. Samuel Little's murderous rampage spanned decades and crisscrossed the United States, leaving a trail of bodies scattered from coast to coast. He preyed on vulnerable women in cities large and small, from the streets of Los Angeles to the back roads of rural Mississippi. His victims, often marginalized and forgotten by society, became mere footnotes in his twisted narrative, their stories silenced by fear and circumstance. The sheer geographical scope of Little's crimes is staggering. He operated in at least 19 states, leaving a trail of death that stretched from California to Florida, from Illinois to Arizona. His ability to move undetected across state lines, coupled with the fragmented nature of law enforcement jurisdictions, allowed him to evade capture for an astonishingly long period. Little's lifestyle enabled him to blend into different communities, becoming a chameleon who adapted to his surroundings with ease. He frequented truck stops, bus stations, and homeless shelters, preying on women who were often transient or struggling with addiction. The vastness of Little's killing field presented a formidable challenge for law enforcement. The lack of communication between different jurisdictions and the absence of a centralized database of missing persons made it difficult to connect the dots between his crimes. Little, a master manipulator and a ghost in the system, exploited these weaknesses, continuing his reign of terror unchecked for decades. Many of his victims were involved in sex work or struggled with addiction, their lives marked by poverty, hardship, and a lack of access to resources. Their vulnerability made them easy targets for Little, who preyed on their desperation and their trust. These women, often dismissed as throwaways by society, were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends, and lives that were brutally cut short by a man who saw them as nothing more than objects to satisfy his twisted desires. The systemic biases that often marginalize vulnerable populations played a significant role in Little's ability to evade capture for so long. Their disappearances often went unreported or were met with indifference by law enforcement, allowing Little to continue his killing spree unchecked. The tragic stories of Little's victims underscore the urgent need for greater awareness and support for marginalized communities. Samuel Little's methods were as chilling as they were effective. He typically targeted women who were alone and vulnerable. Once he had gained their trust, he would overpower them, often strangling them to death with his bare hands. Little's choice of strangulation as his preferred method of killing allowed him to avoid leaving behind the kind of forensic evidence that might link him to his crimes. Unlike gunshots or stab wounds, strangulation leaves fewer obvious traces, making it more difficult for investigators to determine the cause of death. The absence of gunshot residue or other forensic markers made it challenging for law enforcement to connect Little to his victims. This, combined with his nomadic lifestyle and the transient nature of his victims, allowed him to operate undetected for years, leaving a trail of unsolved murders across the country. The chilling efficiency of Little's methods and his meticulous efforts to avoid leaving behind evidence speak to the calculated nature of his crimes. Samuel Little's ability to evade justice for so long is a chilling testament to the failures of the criminal justice system, further hindering the investigation. Little's manipulative skills and his ability to blend into different communities allowed him to remain under the radar for decades, adapting to his surroundings. Samuel Little's psyche presents a chilling enigma, a dark labyrinth of twisted desires and profound detachment from human empathy. Understanding his motivations requires delving into his psychological profile, piecing together a mind warped by trauma and neglect. Experts describe a man consumed by a narcissistic need for power and control, seeing his victims as mere objects. Little's confessions reveal a disturbing lack of remorse, speaking of his victims with chilling detachment. He seemed to relish recounting the details of his murders, demonstrating a perverse pride. This lack of empathy, coupled with his grandiose sense of self-importance, points to a severe personality disorder. The roots of Little's depravity can likely be traced back to his chaotic and unstable childhood. The absence of a stable father figure and the reported prostitution of his mother likely contributed to his distorted perceptions. The neglect and abuse he experienced may have further fueled his rage and resentment. Little's psychological profile paints a picture of a man profoundly disconnected from humanity. Samuel Little's narcissism was a defining characteristic of his personality, a gaping void within him that demanded constant validation and control. He craved attention and admiration, seeking to bolster his fragile ego through acts of violence and domination. His victims, in his twisted worldview, were mere instruments to satisfy his insatiable need for power and control, their lives insignificant in comparison to his own grandiose self-image. Little's narcissism manifested in his manipulative behavior and his chilling lack of empathy. He saw himself as superior to others, entitled to take what he wanted without consequence. His victims, in his eyes, were beneath him, unworthy of his consideration or remorse. The narcissistic void within Little fueled his insatiable need for control. He meticulously planned his crimes, selecting vulnerable victims and disposing of their bodies in remote locations. He reveled in the power he held over them, the fear he could instill with a look or a gesture. Their suffering was irrelevant to him, a mere byproduct of his pursuit of ultimate control. Little's narcissism was not simply a personality flaw. It was a driving force behind his horrific crimes. It was the engine that powered his predatory instincts, the fuel that fed his insatiable need for power and control. Understanding the role of narcissism in Little's psyche is crucial to comprehending the depths of his depravity and the motivations behind his reign of terror. Trauma disrupts emotional regulation and empathy. Little's trauma desensitized him to others' suffering. His pain twisted into a need to inflict pain on others, a distorted attempt to regain control in a chaotic world. Little's trauma manifested in violence and detachment. He struggled to form meaningful relationships, preferring fleeting interactions to avoid vulnerability. His inability to connect further isolated him, reinforcing his alienation and descent into darkness. It underscores the importance of early intervention and support for traumatized children, and addressing the root causes of violence in society. For decades, Samuel Little operated in the shadows, a phantom predator leaving a trail of unsolved murders across the country, leaving investigators frustrated and families of victims desperate for answers. But the long arm of the law, though slow and methodical, eventually reached out to ensnare him, bringing his reign of terror to an end. The turning point in the investigation came in 2012, when Little was arrested in Los Angeles on a drug charge. A routine DNA sample taken at the time linked him to 3 unsolved murders in California, dating back to the late 1980s. These cold cases, previously unconnected, suddenly coalesced into a chilling pattern, revealing the existence of a serial killer who had operated undetected for decades. The DNA evidence provided the crucial link that investigators had been searching for. It connected Little to the murders of Carol Smith, Gwendolyn Turner, and Audrey Nelson, all women who had been found strangled in Los Angeles between 1987 and 1989. The similarities in their deaths, coupled with the DNA match, pointed to a single perpetrator, a predator who had evaded justice for far too long. The DNA match was just the beginning. As investigators delved deeper into Little's past, they uncovered a pattern of criminal behavior that spanned decades and crossed state lines. The long arm of the law, guided by forensic science and dogged determination, was finally closing in on Samuel Little, bringing him face to face with the consequences of his horrific crimes. With the DNA evidence linking him to 3 unsolved murders, Samuel Little faced overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars, he began to confess, not just to the California murders, but to a staggering number of additional killings, unraveling a tale of depravity that shocked even seasoned investigators. Little's confessions were chillingly detailed, recounting his methods, his victims, and the locations of their bodies. He spoke with a disturbing lack of remorse, describing his crimes with a detached matter-of-factness that sent shivers down the spines of those who listened. He seemed to relish the attention, the notoriety that his confessions brought, his narcissistic personality craving the spotlight even in the face of overwhelming evidence of his guilt. As Little continued to confess, the number of victims he claimed to have killed climbed steadily, eventually reaching a staggering 93. His confessions painted a grim picture of a serial killer who operated across the country. His detailed descriptions of the victims and the circumstances of their deaths provided crucial information that helped investigators close dozens of cold cases. Little's confessions, though horrific, provided a measure of closure for the families of his victims. They finally had answers to the questions that had haunted them for decades, finally knew the fate of their missing loved ones. The confessions, though painful, were a crucial step towards justice, a way to ensure that the victims of Samuel Little were not forgotten. In 2018, Samuel Little was convicted of the murders of Carol Smith, Gwendolyn Turner, and Audrey Nelson in California. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Little's conviction marked a significant victory for law enforcement. His confessions led to the identification of numerous additional victims, making him the most prolific serial killer in United States history. Although he died in prison in 2020, his legacy of violence continues to haunt the families of his victims. The case of Samuel Little offers a sobering lesson in the failures of the criminal justice system and societal biases. His ability to evade capture highlights the need for improved communication and collaboration between law enforcement agencies. Little's nomadic lifestyle exposed the weaknesses of a system that struggles to track individuals across state lines. The lack of a centralized database and inconsistent reporting practices created gaps that Little exploited. Many of Little's victims were marginalized women, highlighting the need for greater support for vulnerable communities. Their disappearances often went unreported, showing bias within the circles of law enforcement. The case of Samuel Little is a wake-up call for vigilance, empathy, and justice for all.